Hello, my name is Joshua Adams, and I'm going to be giving my presentation 3 on Chapter 15 of the Technical Communications book. And the title of this chapter is Using Analogy to Explain Technical Ideas. Okay, so there are basically 4 main topics in the chapter. The first topic is what are analogies? And this makes sense because we need to know what analogies are before we can think about applying them to our public speaking skills. The second topic is the power of the familiar. In this topic, they basically talk about how analogies are used to help humans learn and how educators and teachers use them in different ways to help humans relate something that's familiar to them to something that's new and foreign to them. The third topic is analogies in scientific and technical communication. So in this topic, they basically just cover a bunch of examples where scientists from the past have used analogies to explain their new theories and new projects and help other scientists understand what they were doing there. And the final topic is using analogies wisely. So in this one, they just go through and give some pointers on how analogies should be used and how they shouldn't be used. And they really just try and help you with your public speaking skills. Okay, so let's just dive into the first topic. So what are analogies? So analogies consist of two ideas that are related to each other. So basically they take one idea that is foreign and new and they try and think of something that is familiar to everybody and they compare them and try and get you to think about one idea in terms of the other. We often use them every day without even thinking about it. If you do think about it, we as humans try to relate new things that we've never heard of or seen before to things from our past that we're more familiar with to try and learn about them. And lots of people do that every day, and they don't even realize that they're doing it, but it happens. Basically, there's different types of analogies. The two main topics or main types that the chapter talks about are the simile and the metaphor, and we'll just talk about how they are different from each other. So similes tend to use words such as or like to compare two related ideas. So they'll say something like, my girlfriend is hot like the Sahara Desert is hot, or something like that. However, metaphors will directly relate the two topics together. So an example of a metaphor would be something like saying that the brain is a computer, or a computer is a brain, or something like that, where it's like a statement rather than a question. They're directly relating one concept to the other by leaving out the as or like. So now we'll move into the next topic, the power of the familiar. So analogies are fundamentally used to help humans learn. When an analogy is used, it draws upon one of the most fundamental ways in which a human learns, and that is comparing things from our past to things that are happening in the present. We compare things that we already know and we already love to things that we've never seen before to try and help us understand. So some people say that analogies are just a type of dressing up for presentations. They just are there to make something sound better. But these two guys, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, believe that one of the most basic ways that we as humans learn is through analogy. And I think the chapter makes a good point of, this is actually true. We definitely relate familiar things to new things in order to try and learn better. And I think this is something that definitely happens in most people and is a valuable tool for many educators. So I like this quote that Lakoff and Johnson had. It was in the chapter. Lakoff and Johnson described metaphors as experiencing one thing in terms of another. So that really just helps you think about how an analogy works, experiencing one thing in terms of another. So humans are more easily able to learn about a new abstract idea through an idea that they are already familiar with. And that's something that I've kind of already talked about. But yeah, that's basically the idea. So analogies have actually been around for thousands of years. The idea of the analogy is not something that is new or widely debated. Philosophers such as Aristotle used them in their writings around 2,000 years ago, and there are many other philosophers that do similar things to Aristotle. And today, psychologists and educators use analogies in their everyday occupations, and a lot of them study what Aristotle did, and there's something called schema theory, which is a facet of analogies, and analogies are basically the central theme for schema theory, and psychologists like to study schema theory and talk about analogies and do all kinds of things with them. So they are not new. So moving on to the third topic, analogies in scientific and technical communication. So analogies are abundant among the scientific community. They play an important role in helping new scientists understand new concept ideas, mainly because in science, concepts can be extremely difficult to understand, and there's not a lot that, like, for example, atoms. You can't see an atom, so it's very difficult to explain something that you can't see to someone without relating it to something else. So analogies are especially helpful in science, where things can be extremely difficult to understand at times. They're a very valuable tool. So one example of a scientist using an analogy to describe his work is Charles Darwin. The chapter talks about this for a while. Darwin compared his theory of natural selection with the process of human breeding, and he did this to the Catholic Church and the other scientists of his day. And the reason that he used the example of human breeding is because that was a process that was accepted back then. People had studied animal breeding at that point, but they had never really studied natural selection or the theory of evolution, and so it was a difficult concept for people of that time to grasp, and it still is today. So one other example was by James Watson and Francis Crick. Those scientists, they discovered the shape of the DNA molecule, which we now know to be that familiar double helix shape. But back then, how do you describe double helix? That the terminology hadn't been around yet. So what they did was, when they described how a DNA molecule passes its information along, they compared the DNA molecule to a human messenger. The human messenger was taking information from one place to another, and that's really what a DNA molecule does. It takes information from one place to another, so other DNA molecules can build each other up. So this did two things, actually. It related the topic to something familiar, but it also gave the topic a presence of life by introducing the concept of the human messenger, and it made the topic maybe more interesting to some people who are not scientists. So yeah, analogies allow scientists to not only grasp the idea, but they also do something else. They allow us to add a little bit of fun into the mix. Analogies can sometimes be funny, and they can add a sense of color or even life to a specific situation that maybe doesn't have a lot of life to it, such as gamma ray spectroscopy, which is something that I study. It's not very interesting to most people, so an analogy describing it to something else might make it a little bit more interesting. Yeah, so especially in the field of science, ideas can be mundane, but a good analogy can really brighten up something and really re-engage your audience, because you want them to be interested and pay attention. So have fun with it. So for the last topic, using analogies wisely, they just really go in and they give us a couple pointers on some things that we should and shouldn't do. So as with all facets of technical communications, you need to read your audience as you're giving a presentation, and you need to study your audience before you go to give that presentation. And so things that you don't want to do after you've studied your audience is you want to avoid culture-specific, industry-specific, or company-specific analogies that might exclude certain members of your audience and either make them feel out or just flat out make them not understand what's going on if they don't understand the familiar idea that you're presenting to them with to explain the new idea. You want to make sure that whatever analogy you use, it's broad enough that most people would be familiar with the initial idea, so you don't leave people out. So it's imperative to read your audience while presenting, and that's something that goes into all facets of technical communication, not just analogies. You always need to check with your audience, make sure that they're understanding what you're saying, sometimes repeat yourself. But while analogies can be an excellent tool to help convey an idea, they have their limitations, so don't overdo it. You do not want to specifically only use analogies to explain your ideas. There are many other techniques out there that you can use. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now, but there's many other things that you could do to help explain a specific topic. And yeah, that's basically it for that. So do not give an overcomplicated analogy, and this is what I've seen a lot of people do this, and a lot of professors even do this before. What they do is they don't use a one-to-one analogy, and what that means is instead of directly comparing one idea to another idea, they tend to compare an idea to an idea to an idea, and they sort of try to make this jump between ideas, and it just can get really confusing and not a lot of fun for the audience or the professor who's frustrated, and it's just bad. Don't do it. Always stick with the one-to-one. So in conclusion, we talked about what analogies are and what they where they come from. Very important. We talked about how analogies work through the power of the familiar, and how they invoke familiarity inside of people, and how it engages the audience. We talked about how analogies are especially helpful to the scientific community because science is a difficult topic, and analogies can be a tool that aids you in understanding specific concepts within science. And finally, we discussed some ways on how to use analogies wisely, gave some pointers. Don't use multiple analogies. You always use a one-to-one analogy. And yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.